What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? So I am the Godless engineer. Normally we have sort of a lead in, going into this, but we had some technical difficulties. Everybody knows technical difficulties with GE. Me and my bougie ways. Uh, but tonight I have Dr. Richard Carrier here, and we're going to be going over Holy Koolaid, interviewing Bart Ehrman. And I have to say, even my wife Casey was over there pulling her hair out, not literally, but just very agitated with everything that Bart was saying. And there was at least twice where she was like, he just contradicted himself.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of a weird thing for me, at least, because normally, she's asking me things, and then this time she's like, even I can point this out.
Yeah, that's one thing I noticed about this video is that most of the mistakes he makes, except for this grab bag near the end where he just throws out a million different assertions, which do require expertise to evaluate, a lot of his stuff is actually quite straightforwardly demonstrably false. Anyone with any sense of logic could do it. They don't even need to be a historian. We'll get to some examples of that, I'm sure, where I'm pretty sure he's still using Christian apologetics and advocating that as valid historical methodology. And that's he keeps talking about, well, this is how historians do it. And I'm like, no, actually. But I have to point out, like, a lot of what he says is correct. So let's make that a qualification too. There was, like, I'd say about 30% of the video, I agree with him. Like, he's right about that, a lot of that stuff. Some of that, like half of that, is straw men of mythicism, where he can't tell the difference between amateur crank mythicism and actual peer-reviewed mythicism. Like, he doesn't know that there's a difference, and he doesn't know that they argue different things. There's no excuse for this anymore. Like, it's I just don't understand why he can't just read the peer-reviewed literature and address that, and not, like, anyway, that's me on my freaking soapbox. It gets annoying after a while. But a third of what he said was nevertheless correct. And then he's about the other third is about methodological points that are incorrect, where he makes some basic mistakes of logic. And then the other third is like grab bag of things, half of which are irrelevant, don't even relate to the historicity of Jesus. And others are, like you mentioned, some of the just plainly false statements he makes. I'm astonished. It really does surprise me. Why can't we get a more quality critique of mythicism, especially from someone of his prominence?
I really don't know. You would think that he would put, like, top tier effort into this, but I suspect that you're very correct when you say that he has not read any substantial mythicist material.
It's provable from this video, by the way, because he makes a bunch of statements that make it absolutely clear that he does not know what the arguments are. But all he does know, like, a lot of what he's talking about is Acaria-esque Dorothy Murdoch stuff, because that's all he did when he did Jesus Exist? Because my book wasn't out yet. There was no peer-reviewed mythicism yet when he published that book. But he seems to assume that it's all that. And no, the reason we have the peer-reviewed mythicism was specifically to strip away all of that bogus stuff to see what survives review. And so he should be ditching that stuff and then focusing on what has survived peer review. Those are the only arguments he should be addressing now.
No, I totally agree. Before we get into the meat of everything tonight, first I want to point out that I'm quote unquote sponsoring this video with my app Crestus down below that I've sort of updated and maintained with the help of Dr. Carrier here. And so it's available on both platforms, although the calculator right now is currently only available on the iOS, which I'm working on fixing that and making it better. And so I've been working hard on getting that done. But anyways, the first thing that I want to point out is at the very beginning of the video, and I'm gonna switch over to it right now. I don't know whether, like, I just find it to be strange because, like, in this list of mythicists up there, I feel like one of these is not like the other, and that one would be me, because it feels so random that I'm up there, and I'm not exactly sure why I'm listed amongst these people, because We've got a list.
I didn't really look at that list. So, but let's bring it up if you have it. I'm curious.
Oh yeah, it's can you? I'm presenting right now. Can you see it?
No. There is a presentation screen, and it's oh yes, okay, yeah. I see. That's what we're talking about. Yeah. Zindler, Price, Doherty, Carrier, Fitzgerald, and Gleason. Is that it? Just those?
Yeah, those are the ones that they list.
There are only 2 historians who have published under peer review in defense of mythicism. Me and Raphael Lataster, who published with Brill, which is a prestigious academic press. Yeah. Lataster is not here. Fitzgerald is a journalist. Like he reports on scholarly work. He is not himself one of us doing this, right? So he does good reporting on it, and does good books on the subject. But he is himself just reporting on the work of other scholars. Doherty, I would say, would be the closest to an actual scholar. He actually has degrees in classics that are relevant. Not a PhD, but still. And Zindler's done some stuff. He's done some interesting things that are good. Some are good, some bad, in terms of methodology. And Price is famous and has 2 PhDs. So I get why he would be here. But you're right. Like throwing you and Fitzgerald up there, it's almost like they're trying to imply we're all doing the same things. Whereas you're doing the same thing Fitz is doing, where you're just reporting, you're bringing interviewees on and reporting on from the scholarship. You're not claiming to have spearheaded the scholarship yourself,
Strangely enough, I can actually understand putting Fitzgerald up there because he's got 4 books.
He at least has a book. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
He at least has books.
And I just have YouTube videos, which is routinely frowned upon. Like I always suggest do not send people my video. Send actual scholarship. That's why in these videos, especially when I make them very targeted to a specific argument, I always list like the actual sources that are used in my description, so that people aren't using like me as a source. It's the actual academic sources that people are using, and so it seems a little weird to me. That's all that I really kind of wanted to point out there.
True. Yeah. I mean, they didn't really make an argument from this screen, so I don't want to whinge about it too much.
No. I just, like I said, I just wanted to sort of break the ice with all of this and get into more of the actual topic.
Yeah. Yeah.
So to start off with, I've kind of structured tonight's live stream. And we're going to get into that here in a second, but I know, Rick, you wanted to sort of lay the groundwork, for everything right up front here. So, I'll let you do that.
Yeah. So I already gave like some remarks that carry those remarks over, but in addition to that, like I noticed basically a variety of different arguments in here. One was the one about sources. A lot of material is spent on that, which I will get into. I think it's important, where there's a confusion and conflation between hypothetical and actual sources, and the logic by which Ehrman is trying to argue that the hypothetical sources existed is not valid. It's not valid in history or any other field. And it's a common black and white fallacy. Hopefully we'll get into that. Another is the evidence in the epistles. You've interested in going into that as well, where he just makes a bunch of assertions. They're the same assertions that have been refuted over and over again, as if he doesn't even know what the rebuttals are. Like if you know that there are rebuttals to your arguments and you're asked this question, you should say, well, I understand, like my opponents say this is my response to that. Like that's how you should respond. Instead, he just keeps repeating the same refuted statements without defending them. They're authentic, but defending them as if they just not even a question about them. So that happens. And then the whole weird bit about copying deities, that was really strange, and that's one of the classic examples that shows that he does not know what he's talking about. He clearly read like some of Dorothy Murdoch's stuff, and which is crazy stuff, and then he's arguing against that sort of in a sort of slapdash way. But there's no peer-reviewed mythicism makes the arguments that he talks about there. Then there's a little bit about he's talking about Gospel of Thomas and Peter as if they're reliable sources. I found that rather odd. He didn't go into that very much, but I thought that was a strange tack for him to take. He just barely mentions Josephus and doesn't give any arguments relating to Josephus. And then he piles on a bunch of straw men. I noticed there's a ton of straw men where he's doing this, attacking all mythicists as if we make this particular argument, and then he makes an argument that no mythicist who's published under peer review has actually made, nor even anyone like Fitzgerald or you, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, like, and don't make that distinction. Like, we keep making that distinction. So it's not like it's not our fault that they're not making the distinction. They're choosing to not do it, I guess. It's the only thing I can think. And then there's a lot of examples in there where Ehrman shows fundamental ignorance of his own peer-reviewed literature. And I find this is a common problem with Ehrman, whereas if he hasn't looked into a particular subject and study, he just assumes that whatever his brain comes up with is the truth. You know what I mean? Like he doesn't sit there and go, actually, I haven't looked into that, so I can't comment. Like, you never get that from Ehrman. It's always like, well, he's like, oh, well, here's my position on a thing. He's like, actually, that contradicts all the literature of people who've actually studied it. And anyway, so I ran into a lot of examples of that. And then a lot of weird statements he makes about mystery religions that I actually do want to focus on that. I hope you bring that up when we get to it. Where that's, I think, probably one of the most egregious examples of Ehrman not actually checking the literature and continuing to just make assertions that are blatantly false. It is especially weird because he actually cites a book, Meyer's book on the mystery religions, but then acts like he's not read anything in it. You know what I mean? So it's very strange. So he actually says this thing. We'll get to this later, but he actually says, what is it? We don't have any information about these religions. That is a direct quote. I stopped the video and made sure. We don't have any, and he went on and on about this, how we don't have anything. Meyer's book is how many hundreds of pages long? And he cited the book himself. It's not just Meyer just making shit up for hundreds of pages. That's an actual peer-reviewed book. And Meyer's book is only a summary. Like, it is not like a comprehensive collection of all the source materials we have about the mystery religions. And Meyer doesn't pretend it is, but still he cites a lot of it. Anyway, so that's my survey of what happened in that video. And I still want to reiterate, I want to remind people, though, about a third of what Ehrman says in it is correct, like methodologically, factually. So it's not just complete error, complete ignorance all the way through. It's just at certain points, it hits this weird third rail of craziness that just doesn't make any sense to me as to why someone like Ehrman is still doing this.
Yeah, it struck me, like, as you were going through that list, I thought of exact moments in the video where he's doing this. And like, so I kind of wanted to start off with like some of the weaker arguments that they regularly tout out, and I've only got two.
Sure, the straw. I have straw man. I listed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I've actually got. We can play this clip that I've got right here, and you should be able to hear it. But so in this part, it's talking about why mythicists might reject like the Gospels as history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go.
What would it take? Well, but mythicists would push back on that and say that those are all religious documents, and so because they have a religious bias, they can't be trusted.
Okay, so if you have Americans reporting on Abraham Lincoln, does that mean you can't accept the sources because they're Americans? Look, these are documents that were not written as the Bible. People who were writing about Jesus in the first century, yeah, they believed in Jesus, but they weren't writing the Bible. Who writes about Julius Caesar except for somebody who's interested in Julius Caesar? Who writes about Jesus except somebody who's interested in Jesus? You don't rule out sources because they're written by people who are interested in the subject. What you do.
Okay, yeah. He goes on from
none of us make that argument.
Yeah, exactly.
No, we don't argue. It's not our argument. We don't say that. No, none of us say that. That's ridiculous.
Yeah,
so they're arguing against no one, basically.
Right. They're arguing against straw men, or at least against uninformed people. They're like, oh, well, the Gospels are religious, they're Christian, so therefore you can't trust them. But it's like we actually have better arguments to not trust the Gospels.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out that he himself in this same interview makes the point that historians do acknowledge bias is a problem that we have to take into account and so on. That's exactly what we do. He says, like, you can't use different criteria. No, we're using the same criteria that we use for all other books. We're not treating the Gospels as somehow different than any other religious literature of the ancient world. So So anyway, that to me, I thought was a distraction and kind of insulting to peer-reviewed mythicism, because we don't make that argument. And so to like go spend 5 minutes pontificating on how that's a stupid argument, as if that's an argument we make, it's kind of annoying, frankly.
Yeah, I totally agree. And now the other one that I'll mention, and maybe if I missed something in your list of contradictions, we can kind of talk about it. But this next point is something that's been coming up a lot recently in the discourse, and you'll recognize it immediately.
Okay.
The view that you're comfortable with.
I see this meme and others like it tossed around by mythicists a lot to argue that Jesus is just copied from existing deities and ideas of the time. And in your book, Did Jesus Exist?, you mention what seems to be the original source of these claims, which is Kersey Graves' book, The World's 16 Crucified Saviors, Christianity Before Christ. And it contains this idea that people like Mithras, who you just talked about, as well as Dionysus, Horus, and others, all had these similarities with Jesus, where they were born on December 25th of a virgin, had 12 disciples, and that they died and rose again. Is there any validity to this?
That's a pretty, like, his reaction right there is a pretty good summary of what he says.
But that's my reaction too. I've literally written an article about how Kersey Graves is bullshit. Like, right. So no, yes, crazy or amateur or people who don't know what they're doing on the internet mainly might circulate these memes, might say these things, but peer-reviewed literature does not say these things. This is not an argument we make. So yeah, that also was annoying. So it's wasting a lot of time. Now, it wouldn't have been annoying if they'd made that point. They say like, well, actually, yes, you're right. This meme circulates, but that's like peer-reviewed literature, peer-reviewed mythicism doesn't use these arguments, but it is worth pointing out that these arguments are bogus. And so the public should be aware of this. So I do think that it's worth it for him to have debunked those things. He doesn't do a great debunking. It's so like you could do a much better job of it here in this video. But for him to push back on that, I totally agree with, and I think is worth doing. But to act like this is what quote unquote mythicists say, as if peer-reviewed mythicism says this, that is actually kind of damning. I find that disingenuous and insulting. And it's not how a scholar should behave. That is not how you should be interacting with this material.
I totally agree. And I mean, ever since I believe it was Zeitgeist that came out, that one meme has like flooded the internet every so often.
Zeitgeist's material is based on Dorothy Murdoch, and Murdoch is following, there's a guy named Jackson in the early 20th century who did a book on this. And so it has a long pedigree, these weird bogus stories. They accumulate bogusness over time. There are actually several 19th century historians who did things like Kersey Graves did that highly unreliable. I did a blog article on Chemitism, the modern neo-Chemitism, neo-pagan, Egyptian neo-paganism, where I make this point, is that they're still doing what Kersey Graves did, which is like they're just using 19th century unreliable scholarship. Some dude at some point said something and they just assume that that's actually true. They don't actually check the sources or find out if it's factual or not. The whole point of peer-reviewed mythicism is to do the work that those people aren't doing, is actually check what actually holds up, kick to the curb everything that doesn't check out, and only keep what actually survives review. And that's what my book did. That's what Lataster's book did. So this is not relevant to the academic debate about mythicism. This is an amateur internet debate, basically.
Right. Now, I know you had a list. Did you want to go through the list just real quick? You mean of my 5 straw man arguments? Yeah.
Well, you hit the first 2. Like they're already there. I wrote, likewise, Mithras in December 25th and stuff like that. And he goes on about Kersey Graves, not in the peer-reviewed mythicist literature. It's not there. Anyway, what I had for that was he kind of basically argued that we have to have an example of a made-up person from the 1st century. Otherwise, we can't argue this. It's like we have examples from other centuries. We don't need one. That's a kind of like a reverse Texas sharpshooter fallacy where we've hit the target, we've got lots of examples, and then he moves the target and says we missed. Right? It's like it's an arbitrary rule. So you could only get one from the 1st century, only that counts. It's like, no, that's not how history works. He would never accept that argument in any other aspect of his work. So I thought that was ridiculous. So he's kind of strawmanning us in that regard. Because in this way he's doing that, he's ignoring the fact that we do have examples from multiple centuries throughout different eras as well. But Anyway, another one. The other one was the host. So the host goes on about a few things that aren't things that Ehrman himself says, but that are also straw men of mythicism. For example, the whole bit about how the mundane historicist theories, the ones that reject the miraculous and all that stuff, are not extraordinary. They're not extraordinary claims. And it was like, yeah, we totally agree. I give them a decent probability of being true. They are plausible. We're not, at least peer-reviewed mythicists are not saying historicity is implausible, or that it is an extraordinary claim. So to portray us as claiming that it's an extraordinary claim, that somehow you need extraordinary evidence for it, it's not what we're arguing. He also says that Jesus is more attested than almost any other figure of his time. Ehrman agrees with him, but of course what they list, nothing on that list is independent of the Gospels, or nothing on that list can they prove is independent. They have no evidence that anything on the list is independent of the Gospels, other than the epistles. There's some epistles before the Gospels, but those are ambiguous. Mm-hmm. So really, there's only two categories of evidence. There's the pre-Gospel stuff, which is weirdly ambiguous. It shouldn't be. It should actually be more clear than the Gospels are, but nonetheless, it is ambiguous. And then everything after the Gospels, which either directly references the Gospels or was produced so much after the Gospels that we can't confirm that it didn't come anywhere else. And in fact, he mentions Pliny. Pliny does not actually say Jesus is historical. I suspect he was told Jesus was, but what Pliny says outright is that I know nothing about this religion. I have no way of figuring out how to find out anything about this religion. The only way that I could find anything about this religion was to strong arm some of the worshippers of it and ask them what they believed. And then he also wrote to Trajan to ask as well. And Trajan writes back with no actual information about Christianity, just a legal ruling. So this is important because Pliny is telling us that even he has no way of figuring out whether Jesus existed or not. His only access, the only documentation he has is whatever Christians tell him in the 2nd century. That's his source. And so we have that for over and over and over again. You know, if Tacitus mentioned Jesus, that's disputable. But even if he did, his most likely source was Pliny, who got this information from Christians who would have been reading the Gospels and just quoting them back at Pliny. So we have no way of even saying what Ehrman says at one point was like, everyone back then knew Jesus existed. It's like, no, they didn't know Jesus existed. Knowledge is justified true belief. There was no justified true belief about this because, or there might have been true belief, but there's no justified belief about it because it's clear no one had any sources. Celsus, Ehrman goes on about Celsus. Celsus makes clear, at least from the quotations we have from Origen, that his only sources were the Gospels. He had no other sources of information about Jesus, none. So you can't say that, therefore Celsus proves that Jesus existed. No, all Celsus did is he read the Gospels, assumed that they were exaggerating some historical dude, and made fun of them. That's what he did. That was his whole historical procedure. He did not do any fact-checking of the Gospels. He couldn't. There's no way to fact-check whether Jesus existed. All you've got is that people claiming he existed. And so let's make fun of that claim. And so that's what they do. So that doesn't allow you as a historian to argue that Celsus is independently corroborating the Gospels. He's not. All he's corroborating is that the Gospels exist and that say the things they do. So you can't use Celsus as an independent source. Yet they list him as an independent source. That's not how history works. You can't do history that way. And so that's another one of those. And then the last one, the whole bit about Nazareth. Peer-reviewed mythicists do not question the existence of Nazareth. That is not our argument. And this straw man shows us two things. One is that he doesn't know what peer-reviewed mythicists argue. And two, he has no response to it because he doesn't know what it is. So he doesn't know what we argue. We don't argue that it didn't exist. I've even argued explicitly in my book that even if it didn't exist, that is not an effective argument against Jesus existing. Right? So because it could not exist and have been assigned to Jesus for the same reasons that it would be assigned to a mythical Jesus. So its not existing would not be an argument at all for the non-existence of Jesus. He doesn't even know that I argued that because he doesn't frickin' read the literature. He doesn't even know what he's talking about. And so that's that kind of stuff what peeves me. You know, it's really annoying at this point. There's no reason why he can't know what our arguments actually are. Instead, he goes on and on about, he says literally, mythicists, took this quote, made sure I got the quote right. Mythicists all say there was no Nazareth. No peer-reviewed mythicist says that, or no author of a peer-reviewed defense of mythicism says that there was no Nazareth. It's not a thing. So anyway, that was my list of the straw men.
Right. Yeah. And if we have time, I do actually have a point to make about the Nazareth thing, if I can, but you know, it'll depend on how much time we have. But yeah, I thought that was a great list. And I mean, it's actually, I was when I started to interrupt you before, isn't it quite odd that Pliny doesn't know anything about like Christians or Jesus, if you know they were actually like as popular as claimed to be?
Correct. Yeah. You have to draw the conclusion, if you're acting like a historian and not an apologist, you have to draw the conclusion that Christianity was so fringe, so small, so unadhered, there's so few people practicing it, that for someone like Pliny, and I go through this list in Jesus from Outer Space and in one of my blogs, I go through the list of the qualifications Pliny had. Pliny was probably the most qualified person on earth at that time to talk about what Christian beliefs were, if Christians were actually popular enough to be known. But he says he was never been at a trial involving Christians. And this is a guy who's probably one of the most legally educated and legally experienced people in the empire, had all of relevant positions in Rome, as judge, as legal expert, as administrator, general. Like he's served every possible role where he would have run into Christians before, unless they were super, super fringe. It was a struggle to even find them. And so you have to admit that that's the case. Christianity was super small. And when Pliny finds some eventually, and he's kind of forced to root them out, he finds some, and he finds out actually most of the people that got ratted out, he says, had quit the religion decades ago. So it was hard to find someone who even stayed. So it's only the most fanatical of the fanaticals are still a Christian, and it's still hard to find them. But it's clear that he has no documentation, no histories to consult, not even his dad's history of Rome, which is a point I make in the book. He has no documentation to rely on about Christians at all. He has no experience. He's never run into them. He's been all over the Roman Empire as a legal expert and never run into them. He says outright, the only way he could learn anything about what Christians believe was to literally strong arm some deaconesses, he says, some of the women who were officiants at the local church. That was the only way he could find out anything about Christianity, which tells you that there are no sources, right? Mm-hmm. There's no way anyone in his time could actually verify any of this stuff. So the only way they could react to it is say like, oh, that's just ridiculous, which is what he says. It just says, it's just a ridiculous superstition, essentially. It's not an exact quote, but it's paraphrase, is his response to it. That's really the only way you can object to it. So that's relevant. I think that's the point that you were bringing up about how Pliny just seems to be so ignorant. And you can't explain that unless you dismiss all the Christian apologetical triumphal narratives of the success of Christianity.
Right. I totally agree. Obviously. I do want to remind people that if you want to ask Dr. Carrier a question or myself a question, feel free to use the super chats. We will be going over those at the very end. I've actually got a program where I can bring them up on the screen. And so, we'll be able to answer your questions. So do consider doing a super chat if you have any questions that you definitely want to get answered. Now, next on my list of topics to talk about, as they are many, so the next thing I have is his discussion on the dying and rising gods. This is a pretty big topic because Bart Ehrman in particular regularly claims that there weren't any dying and rising gods, or at least there wasn't like a mythium.
I know, he keeps saying that, and this is very embarrassing of him to keep doing this. Because it just repeatedly shows that he is not doing any research on this. He's not reading any of the literature. And in fact, it's even more embarrassing than that, because he cites Jonathan Z. Smith in the interview, and he makes claims. He says, and quote unquote, Jonathan Z. Smith looks at all this material. False. Jonathan Z. Smith, his entire book, Drudgery Divine, only examines one specific claim about one specific God claims. It's one thing to do, one particular religious claim about Dionysus, and that's all he does. Dionysus / Zagreus, this so-called construct myth. And he only examines the modern scholarly reconstruction of the Zagreus myth. That's based, and it relates to Dionysus and so on. But that's all Jonathan Z. Smith does. There is zero material in Smith's book about any of the other dying and rising gods, at least that relates to evidence regarding them. And yet Ehrman says he looks at all this material and refutes that there aren't any dying and rising gods. That is not in Smith. Now, Smith might claim that. I know, like outside his book and possibly in his book, he makes that claim. But the book never addresses this. It never shows that this is true because he only examines one claim. The Z. Smith book is all about one claim only. But the relevant point here is that Ehrman doesn't know that, right? So that means he has not even read Jonathan Z. Smith. He's just quoting Jonathan Z. Smith or citing Jonathan Z. Smith in defense of Ehrman's belief that there are no dying and rising gods. There's no evidence for this. I mean, this is coming from anyone else. This would be evidence of amateurism, right? This would be a complete incompetence. There's no professional ethical reason why Ehrman should be doing this. He should know, first of all, don't cite the book if you haven't read it. 2, get correct what's in the book. 3, don't say things are in the book that aren't in the book. And 4, most importantly, actually check the stuff. Don't just listen to Jonathan Z. Smith. Oh, I heard him in a talk one time make this statement in one sentence. That is not scholarship. That is the opposite of that's just reporting on scholarship. If you want to do scholarship, Bart Ehrman, if you want to be a scholar, you have to check the facts yourself. And I've provided ample citations of direct evidence, for, textual evidence, archaeological evidence, and so on. I've cited scholarship on this. There's no excuse for him, none whatsoever anymore, to continue making these false claims. And I'll give you an example of one of these. He says, no humans die and come back to life, quote unquote. Well, Romulus, Zalmoxis, Osiris, Dionysus, they're all humans. They're all demigods. Well, Zalmoxis is just an ordinary guy. Romulus is an incarnate demigod, but so is Jesus, right? So Jesus isn't a human either, by the way. He's a demigod. So it's already a false analogy, right? It's not like, look at the nativity narratives, or even if you look, and he even mentions, or he doesn't mention in this video, but he has mentioned elsewhere that he now agrees that the first Christians, believers after the death of Jesus, believe that Jesus was an incarnate, pre-existent celestial being. So that he actually is a divine being, even while he was walking around on earth. That was a Christian belief before even Mark wrote his gospel. Mm-hmm. So Ehrman believes this. He agreed. He didn't. There was a time when he didn't, but he now agrees that this is the fact. Which is an example of what I've noticed about Ehrman, is that he attacked me for taking this position, and I attacked him for saying, dude, there's a whole peer-reviewed literature on this. What are you talking about? I didn't just make this up. And then suddenly, a couple of years later, oh gosh, he actually decides to look into this question and discovers, he's surprised. Oh my gosh, there's a whole bunch of peer-reviewed literature that makes this argument. Oh my gosh, they have good arguments. I agree with them. And I'm like, yeah, thanks. An apology would be nice. No, he'll never acknowledge that he attacked me for taking a position that he now agrees is well represented in the scholarship and that he agrees with. But that's what he did. He didn't check, right? When he was attacking me, he didn't check. And then for some other reason, he was doing research for a book, and he decided to check. And golly, look what he found. He found that he was wrong all along, and that I was right. And that the scholarship, there's tons of peer-reviewed scholarship that establishes this. The evidence is strong, and he agrees with it and lays it out in his book, How Did Jesus Become God? And so that's annoying, but that's what he does, right? He just makes these assertions until he gets a bug up his ass and decides to actually check. And usually when that happens, it doesn't support what he was arguing before. But this is an example of that. He's not checking. There are tons of humans who are humans in every sense that Jesus is believed to have been, who die and rise from the dead. He says that there are no gods who return to earth after rising from the dead. I'll point out, neither did Jesus originally. Jesus doesn't return to earth in Paul. He appears celestially, right, in Revelations. So there's no return to earth. That's a gospel invention. The gospels invent the idea of Jesus walking around on earth after his death. And guess where they get that story? They get that story from other pagan deities and heroes who did exactly the same thing, including Osiris, Zalmoxis, Romulus, Dionysus. And this is scholarly conjecture. There's direct textual evidence for this. It's not, and pre-Christian at that. He makes a whole point about how these things changed over time. And so you can't use later evidence. I was like, no, we have pre-Christian evidence, dude. How do you not know that we have pre-Christian evidence? It frustrates the hell out of me that he just won't fact check this stuff. And so he just blurts out false statement after false statement after false statement with total confidence basically deceiving the audience into giving them the impression that he's checked these things when he hasn't, and he's just wrong. And I don't understand how you can maintain respectability and act like that as a scholar.
Yeah, I don't understand either. Now, one of the things that is regularly done with this, as well as the I'm trying to think of the word of it right now. But what's typically done is they require hyper specific criteria for like the whole dying and rising God thing.
Yeah. He didn't make that argument in this interview, so I'll give him credit for that. But no, he made the worst argument, which was no, they don't come back to Earth at all. No, they don't. There no human died or rose at all. Like it's even worse. It's like a blanket statement. He doesn't say like, well, yeah, there are some examples, but they don't exactly fit. Which we agree with. None of us peer-reviewed ethicists claim that there's an exact fit. We don't claim that Jesus is Osiris 2.0. In fact, that's an exact statement in my book. Jesus is not Osiris 2.0. That's almost verbatim from the book. But I'll just know what you're talking about. Let me just list some of the quotes I got. He says about the mystery religions and about dying and rising gods, they don't know any of the details. False, meaning scholars don't know any of the details. We have tons of details. There was capital punishment if you were to reveal the details. Therefore, that's why we don't have any details. That's false. Under the Roman Empire, when the time that's relevant, and even after classical Athens, there was not capital. After classical Athens, there was not capital punishment for revealing the truths. And in fact, Hippolytus, one of the Christian great heresiologists of the early 3rd century, wrote 2 whole chapters, 2 whole volumes on the contents of the mystery religions. But those books were destroyed. The medieval Christians tore them out of his multi-volume work, and they're lost. But he had enough material to write 2 whole volumes on them, right? And we have tons of references. We have inscriptions. We have archaeological evidence. We have tons of references. We've got Apuleius wrote a whole religious novel about the mysteries of Isis and Osiris. He goes through the entire induction ceremony, the secret mysteries of Isis that he went through. He refers to there being even more advanced mysteries of Osiris that he hadn't gone through yet. But we have a whole narrative of it. So like we have tons and tons of evidence. Meyer, like I said, him alone has hundreds of pages of material, and that's just a drop in the bucket of what we've got. But no, what does Ehrman says? We don't have any information about these religions. That is a direct quote. That's wildly false. Why is he making these statements? Gods who die are not gods who come back to Earth. False. As I note, neither does Jesus, but never mind. Originally, only the Gospels do that. But where do the Gospels get that idea? Like I said, they get the myths of returning gods, resurrected gods. Romulus is a classic example. The Emmaus narrative is clearly a transvaluation of the Romulus narrative. And this is also peer-reviewed literature. Richard Miller has written a whole book on this, but many other scholars have done so. There's a lot of peer-reviewed literature on this. And then the humans thing. No humans die and come back to life. That's false. It's not even true of Jesus, but anyway. But yeah, so the mystery cult stuff is just garbage. Like he just literally does not know what he's talking about, and has made, after years of being criticized for this, has made no effort to know what he's talking about. Like he hasn't done any of the work on this, and I just don't understand how a scholar of his prestige and level can act like that. I know I said that before, but I just, case after case after case, this keeps happening, and I don't understand it. Like it doesn't make sense to me. Like even, I don't know. I just can't explain why he acts like this, and it doesn't make sense for him to do so. And it's repetitious. So we can move on to another topic, but I think that's the general gist that I got out of this whole interview.
Yeah, I agree. The one thing that I was thinking about earlier was syncretism. They often don't understand what it means to syncretize one religion with another religion, because they always I hear this from a lot of people. It's like, oh, well, this Jesus is not exactly like Osiris, and is not exactly like these other things, and they don't realize that it's the differences that actually are the important part.
Right. And syncretism doesn't work the way the amateur internet, I conflated the two words, internet and amateur. Amateur internet mythicists will argue is that, it's just an exact copy. That is not what actually happens. That's not what happens in any religion. What they do is they borrow elements and then they alter them and integrate them with what came before. So Judaism, when it borrowed Zoroastrianism, it wasn't just Zoroastrianism 2.0. They borrowed a few ideas, integrated them into the Judaism that they had, and altered those ideas to fit. So the ideas are changed. They're in a different context. But that doesn't mean that they didn't borrow those ideas. I mean, chronologically, it's obviously did. Because none of these Zoroastrian beliefs that are in Judaism were in it before their contact with Persia. And then suddenly after their contact with Persia, they start showing up. And that's the general resurrection, apocalyptic history, Satan's war with God, it's all of those things. Even a flaming hell, which not all Jews believed in, but it was at least there were some people advocating. But that the idea of the earth being melted and sinners all being burned up comes from Zoroastrianism. That was not an original. You don't find that in pre-Persian influence Israelite religion.
Well, and I'm glad you brought that up, because another thing that's commonly done is that they think that everything about Jesus has to come from like one source, or right. Everything has to come from Zoroastrianism in order for there to be some kind of connection there.
Yeah.
They don't really understand the link between like the scriptures as well as other influences other than Zoroastrianism.
Yeah, and how they get combined into a new thing. I don't want to go on to this too much, because I don't want to give the impression that Ehrman in this interview made any of those arguments. He did not. So we're criticizing a general criticism that exists out there, but it's not one that was in this video.
Right. Was there anything else that you wanted to say on the mystery religions? I
think I said enough. For people who want to see that, I wrote a blog. Well, actually, you could get it in my book, Jesus from Outer Space. I have a blog article on dying and rising gods, but in my book, Jesus from Outer Space, I have it too. But if you go to the blog, that has the references that you can get. So you can actually see the actual stories, the firsthand texts, the evidence we have, how it actually works out. And these points that we made just now are also made there. So if you want to see how a scholar who's actually researched this stuff and actually knows what he's talking about gets to the conclusion on these things, go read my blog on it. That sort of summarizes how I got to the position that I am and all the research I did to get there, and why I take the position that I do. It's based on not just all the research relating to the dying and rising gods that actually exists. There's tons of evidence, tons of scholarship, but also on religious history generally. So you mentioned syncretism as a phenomenon. You cannot talk competently about the origins of Christianity if you do not understand syncretism as a religious phenomenon. So you have to understand the anthropology of religion, the history of religions. You have to know these things. You've got to know the context of human history of religion to know what syncretism is and how it works, and to look at other examples of how it's worked. And the flood myths, for example, how they evolve and change and get adopted by other cultures and altered. We have tons of examples outside Christianity of how syncretism operates. So there's no excuse to claim that you don't know. No, we have tons of scholarship on this. Go find out, and then you'll understand how to look at the evidence for Christianity, because you will do it from the eyesight that is informed with the background evidence of how religions evolve and change and how new religions start. You got to study the whole science, the whole context of how new religions start, particularly in the ancient world, particularly how ancient literature gets produced. I have a whole big thing, and I'm going to go on probably in my blog about this, about how Ehrman's complete flabbergasting ignorance of how ancient education and literature operated. It comes very clear in this video, and it's shocking. There's no excuse for it at this point in this debate with him. He's been told over and over again which authors to read, where to go and understand how ancient education taught authors to write, how authors compose stories. He should know this by now. He wrote a whole book on forgery. There's no excuse how could he do that and not know any of this stuff? I just don't understand it. And by the way, his book on forgery is excellent, especially the peer-reviewed version, the forgery and counter-forgery. The pop market version is good too, but if you want the real scholarly version with the footnotes and the bibliography and everything, forgery and counter-forgery is a really good work of scholarship. So he has the skills. He knows how to apply them. There's no excuse for him to not do it. And it's not because he's an amateur. It's because he just chooses to not act like a professional when it comes to this issue. And I can't explain it.
I too am baffled. There's actually a couple points on my list here that I'm utterly baffled by, but hopefully we can get to.
Let's get to some of those.
Yeah. Well, the next point that I wanted to kind of bring up, and I do have clips if you want to refresh your memory on it or anything like that. which I know that you have extensive notes, but I do have certain clips. And I'm gonna have to actually play maybe a couple of these because it comes from his most recent like where he responds to comments. So I have that, but
Okay.
It's Paul's cosmic Jesus and that entire discussion, because he not only goes through like talking about why Paul didn't believe in a cosmic Jesus, but he also lays out like pretty much the historicist foundation using Paul for arguing that Jesus existed on earth. And I didn't know if maybe you I know you're raring to go for that.
If you have a clip, roll it. Yeah, I'm ready.
Oh, okay, definitely. Hold on. Let me get it pulled up to that position. So sorry.
No worries. Yeah.
Okay. All right. All right, here we go.
Yeah.
This will look at the writings of Paul and say that Paul didn't actually believe in a physical Jesus, that he believed in either some sort of cosmic deity or something that was later interpreted as a physical Jesus. How would you push back against that? What evidence do we have to show that Paul actually believed that Jesus?
Yeah.
Now I just want to correct for people that this people do this all the time. He says Paul didn't believe in a physical Jesus. That's wrong. The peer-reviewed mythicist thesis, which is the stripped-down Doherty thesis that I passed through peer review at Sheffield Phoenix, and that Lataster also examines in his book for Brill, does not say that it wasn't a physical Jesus. The only thing that's different is where it happened. Where did Jesus acquire a physical body that physically died? That's the only thing that differs. So Paul does believe in a physical Jesus, on mythicism, even on mythicism. Paul believes in a physical Jesus who really did die. He really did become incarnate, really did die, and so on. So it is a physical historical Jesus in that sense. It's just not the Galilean guy that's walking around preaching it, right? So it's stuff that happened in a celestial or otherwise some other realm than ordinary human interaction. So it just annoys me when people keep saying that Paul didn't believe in it. You say Paul didn't believe in a physical Jesus. Like, you've got this wrong. I also don't say that it is not Jewish, that he didn't have a Jewish body. That's actually scripturally important that the incarnated body be Jewish, in fact, Davidic. That scripture required this, so obviously it had to be. So that this does not contradict mythicism at all. And in this interview, it's clear that neither of these guys have actually read the peer-reviewed thesis that I develop on the historicity of Jesus. So they don't know any of these things about it. And so they're not responding to it. They're just not responding to the actual peer-reviewed literature on this subject.
Yeah, and it's very important to understand how the Jews considered the celestial realm, because that's one thing that I take away from a lot of historicists, is that they think that the celestial realm is like non-physical, like it's how we think of heaven now.
Yes.
So yeah,
they might even interdimensional. They think it's another dimension somewhere. That is a modern idea. That was not ancient at all. And that was my first chapter in Jesus from Outer Space. Disabuses people of these anachronisms. The ancient world did not believe these things. And if you want to understand Christianity, you have to understand the context in which it actually arose, and not apply these anachronistic assumptions back upon it, which is not what was happening.
Yeah, and I don't know it. Just a little bit of a side note, Dr. Craig Evans, I've actually been doing a series on my channel where I'm looking at an interview he recently did, and he actually blames mythicists for being anachronistic.
Yes, they often do that. Yeah.
It baffles me, because it's like, I'm not being anachronistic. I'm just taking it in its context. He literally does anachronistic things all the time when doing this. Okay, so let's see what Bart has to say about this entire thing.
Yeah.
Jesus was a real person who lived and breathed and died in this time period.
Well, read the letters. I mean, Paul quotes Jesus in several places. He quotes what Jesus said at the Last Supper. He knows.
Shows that Ehrman does not even know what our argument is. We don't say that he didn't do that. Like, yes, Paul refers to talking to Jesus a lot. He talks about revelations of Jesus in 2 Corinthians 12. He has a whole conversation with Jesus. Now, it's in his mind, but even Ehrman would have to agree that the Jesus that Paul quotes in 2 Corinthians 12 is not the historical Jesus. No historical Jesus said, even if there was a historical Jesus, he did not say those things, because Paul's talking to this guy long after he's dead, and having these conversations with him, believing that it's actually him. He refers to revelations of the Lord, revelations, and so on. So yes, obviously Paul is going to be quoting the revelations of the Lord that he's had communications with, and right here, I received from the Lord. Mm-hmm. Paul's talking about a revelation. Jesus himself told him this, right? And you'd have to admit that means that that's not the historical Jesus that he's getting that from, nor is he getting it from a tradint. Paul doesn't say, there's nobody here mentioned as being present. He doesn't say he learned this as the story goes or as the disciples report or any of this stuff. No one is present at this vision that he's talking about. Jesus isn't talking to any disciples in this vision. Paul doesn't call it the Last Supper, even though Ehrman claims that Paul does, but Paul does not call it the Last Supper. That is an invention of the Gospels. It's not here. And so the whole point is that you want to look at Paul as if the Gospels don't exist, and then see, like, well, what does this look like he's saying? Like, if this were any other religion, if it wasn't Christianity, and if you read this, and if I received from Mithras that which I also really, if it was that, we would all admit, like, oh, okay, he's talking about some sort of revelation that he got, because he talks about getting revelations from Mithras all the time, right? So, like, if it was another religion, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But because it's Christianity, it just can't be. Even though Paul repeatedly says that he gets statements and sayings from Jesus by revelation, it can't be the case that anytime he quotes him, he's getting it by revelation. No, obviously, it's what's happening. So anyway, this is a classic example of where Ehrman is not even responding to the argument. Like, he doesn't even know what the argument is. So he's like citing these passages. He's saying these things as if we don't know this, right? It's like, oh my gosh, I didn't know that passage was in there. Holy crap, that refutes my theory. This is just flabbergasting. Is how a scholar can act like this. But anyway, yes, continue.
Well, yeah. One point I want to make, though, is that this is one piece of evidence of a historicist doing something anachronistic, and that's inserting information from the Gospels into Paul's work, and you can't do that. And I
wouldn't call that anachronistic as so much as presumptive, right?
Okay.
It presumes the conclusion in your premise. So you're assuming that the Gospels are relating a historical event, rather than, that's the thing we're supposed to prove, not assume. And then from that assumption, you're concluding that Paul is therefore here referring to that historical event. But notice the starting premise was assuming that was already the case. So you can't non-circularly get the conclusion out of this. It's a circular argument. It's a straightforward fallacy of circular argument here. You can't presume these things. So if you don't presume that the Gospels are recording a historical event, and you just read this text as it's written with no presumptions, and then the only context you use is Paul's own context, in other words, things Paul said about Revelation, for example, if you look at it that way without presumption, you get the result that this actually is at least as likely to be a reference to Revelation, or if not more likely to be a reference to Revelation. At the very least, you can't, even at best, you can't insist that this is a reference to history, a historical tradition, because it's 50-50. Even at best, it's 50-50 whether what he means by I received from the Lord, even otherwise when he says he received from the Lord, he means revelation. But if here he means historical tradition, you don't know that. You have no evidence that that is the case. It is a presumption. It is not a premise. So at best, it's 50-50, in which case you can't use this as evidence either way, right? Because if you don't know. And this is another, we might get into some other examples later. This is an error Ehrman makes a lot in this video, where he makes the point about sources, where he gives the analogical argument, and we'll get to that later, I guess, but he'll make the analogical argument that, well, we know Luke used at least Mark as a source and maybe one other source, and he thinks Q, I think Matthew. But Luke says, like, how he used multiple sources. Well, he actually just says more than one. So, and we know he used two, at least Matthew and Mark, or Mark and Q. He used at least two. There's no reason to believe he used any other. Luke doesn't name any others, doesn't name them either. So we can't really, but anyway, he uses the analogy though. Since Luke used sources that we know about, then it is plausible, he uses the word plausible, that Luke used other sources that we don't have for other material. And that is true, it's plausible. But then he says that therefore the burden of evidence is on anyone who would suggest otherwise. That is logically invalid. That is actually a straight up fallacy, because we have the converse analogic argument, which is that we know Luke makes stuff up, and we know, the nativity stuff, right? So we know Luke is either Matthew's making up the nativity, and then Luke is changing stuff and he's making that up. And even if Luke didn't make it up, his source did. Like, none of that nativity stuff is true. Even Ehrman would agree that it's not true. So someone's making stuff up. So you can't. So we know that, well, if Luke's making some stuff up and he's using sources, then when we look at other material, it could either be made up or it could come from a source, right? It's one or the other. We have the equally strong analogical argument for both conclusions. So he says the burden of evidence is on the person who says it's made up. But no, the burden of evidence is on both of us, because it's 50-50 as it is, because we have examples and evidence of using sources and we have examples and evidence of making things up. 50-50, we don't know, which means there's a third possibility here, which is literally that we don't know, right? So it's not like, oh, the burden of evidence is on someone to prove that it's made up. Otherwise, we get to conclude that, therefore, and use as a premise that it was used as source. That is logically invalid, because the third possibility is that you don't know which it is, and therefore you can't use it for either argument. And in most cases, I'd say 99% of the cases, we don't know. So that's the third possibility, is we don't know whether the Emmaus narrative was something Luke made up or he got it from someone else. We don't know. Now, we can make a really good argument that it was made up, no matter who did make it up. Someone made it up. It was probably Luke. But the point being is that even at best, even at the being most generous to historicity, when you look at like the Emmaus narrative, we don't know whether that was something Luke made up to make a point, or if it was something that actually had, or it was something that he had a source for, even if the source made it up. Same thing with Lazarus, the resurrection of Lazarus and John. We don't know if John made that up. Now, I think we can make a really good argument, evidence-based argument, that he made it up. And I go into that on the historicity of Jesus. But you could say at best, well, maybe he had it from a source. Sure, maybe. Or maybe he made it up. We don't know. So you can't use it as a premise and say, oh, well, then John had a source for the Lazarus narrative. That is not how that works. You have to pass a burden of evidence to prove that that's the case, right? So so Ehrman's attempt to burden shift is another fallacious argument. No historian argues like this in any other field of history. This is blatant fallacy mongering here, and it's very much like a Christian apologist. Ehrman he's in this black and white mindset that it either has to be made up and we know it's made up, or we know that it's a source. Like, those are the only two options. And that's a Christian apologist thinking. That is not a historian thinking. The historian knows that 90% of the time it's in the middle. You actually don't know which it is. So you can't use it as evidence. You can't claim, like he does in this video, that everything in Luke that isn't sourced from what we would say Matthew and Mark comes from this other source, or a collection of sources. He admits it could be multiple sources. We don't know that. We have no evidence of that, nor is there any valid historical argument that would get you to that conclusion. What he's doing is pure fallacy. Like, it's not history. And yet he's here like insisting this is how historians reason. No, historians do not reason like this. This is not how historians operate with sources. Most of the material that historians look at, historians admit they don't know if it has a source or if it's made up, particularly in a document that makes up a lot of things, like the Gospels do. So this idea that you can somehow, the burden has to be pushed on the mythicist is false. The burden could, in some cases, the burden could be equal on either of us, and neither of us can meet the burden. And if that's the case, then the passage is useless. We can't use it to argue for mythicism, but we also can't use it to argue for historicity. And that's just reality in history. That's most evidence is going to be ending up in that state. But Ehrman, that doesn't exist. Like, he's total black and white thinking. He cannot even comprehend the status of just not knowing something, and that the premise being that we don't know. And that to me is not a historian talking. That is a Christian apologist, and that's someone like Bart Ehrman, who's almost his whole education was by fundamentalists early on, and then by religious believers later. So all his training has been in Christian apologetics, and then he became an agnostic. Mm-hmm. And I think he never figured out that he was misled, that the methods that he were taught, the way of thinking about these things was wrong. It actually is not valid, and it is not used anywhere outside of Christian apologetics or biblical studies. And he doesn't know that, right? And he's figured that out for some things. It's obvious. In this video, he talks about, he criticizes Christian apologetics a lot in this video. So he has figured out some things were wrong that he was taught, and he's gotten away from it. But there are other things that he's just not checked realize that he's wrong. He's not being logical. He's being fallacious. And I know he hates being told that, but that his response to being told that an argument he has is fallacious is to complain that we're calling his arguments fallacious rather than to correct his arguments. But anyway, so that's a huge digression that's spurred by this piece. We're still in the middle of him giving examples.
Yeah, we are. That's fine. We'll continue, and his next screen's gonna pop a blood vessel too. At least it did for me.
Yeah, let's go.
Paul quotes Jesus in several places. He quotes what Jesus said at the Last Supper. He knows Jesus' disciple Peter. He knows Jesus' brother James. I mean, he personally knows him. He's met with them. He talks about Jesus being born of a woman. I mean, he was born and he had disciples and he was a Jew and he ministered to Jews. Paul says things about Jesus' life. I mean, he doesn't get.
I'm just going to go ahead and stop right there because that's kind of a gish gallop of bad information.
Yeah, it is a gish gallop. And the last point is false. Paul never says Jesus ministered to the Jews. In fact, Paul says something that denies that he did. In Romans 10, Paul says that the only way the Jews could learn what Jesus preached is through the apostles, which tells you that Jesus did not preach to the Jews. So it's the other way around. Now, I assume he's referring to a verse that is in some English translations says Jesus was the minister to the Jews, but it's deacon, not minister. It is servant to the Jews, not minister to the Jews. So the actual Greek does not say Jesus preached to the Jews. It says something else. It means something else. So he even here, he's reading the English Bible and not checking the Greek. There's no excuse for him to do that. He can read Greek. I know he can do this. There's no reason for him to act like that. But the other stuff is at least superficially true. But he speaks here as if he's never heard of the rebuttals to any of these things, right? Especially when he talks about the woman thing. He just laughs like, oh, ridiculous, as if there's no argument to respond to. So there's only two possibilities here. One is that he doesn't even know what our arguments are, in which case he's not competent or qualified to be discussing our arguments, or he's lying. He is deliberately misrepresenting mythicism by pretending that we don't have any arguments against these passages. Now, I suspect from all the other evidence of his blatant and repeated ignorance that it's the ignorance explanation and not the lying explanation. In this case, I think he just literally doesn't know that we have arguments about these things. Or what they are. He might have run into some of the non-peer-reviewed stuff before he published Did Jesus Exist? But all the peer-reviewed stuff came after that book, and he just hasn't read it, refuses to read it, doesn't know what's in it. His own peer-reviewed literature on this subject, he refuses to read and doesn't know anything about it. So that means he's not qualified to discuss this debate, in my opinion.
Yeah, I totally agree. And just for anybody that's wondering, like the born of a woman passage, that's actually contained within a larger allegory. So it's an allegorical birth that he's talking about there.
Yeah, Paul outright says these women are allegories, and he goes into the whole, and he starts from the beginning as the allegorical, how Gentiles are allegorically the seed of Abraham too. So the whole passage, the whole argument is couched in a context of he's talking about allegory and symbolism. And there is, if you look at it in context, there's no even reason for him to mention a biological birth to a woman. It has no relevance to his argument. Whereas if you see his reference to the women right after this, when he's talking about women and what that means in his argument, it obviously is an allegorical reference. It refers to what his metaphysical argument is. But that's, at least you could argue that, right? Like I can understand it. Like you said, well, I know the argument is this, right? Is that it's an allegory, etc. And here's my rebuttal, right? That would at least be legitimate as a behavior for a scholar. But no, in this case, he doesn't even seem to be aware that the argument exists that he's supposed to be rebutting. He doesn't even seem to know what the context of this verse is. Like it's like he's never checked, despite having been told to multiple times. And that's what's frustrating. Is like here he's just ignoring what our arguments are, declaring facts that we've already rebutted as if we hadn't rebutted them, and acting like this is a surprise, like, oh my gosh, I've just refuted the mythicists. And that is not how scholars act. That is how apologists act. But it is not how scholars act. And so he's not acting like a scholar here.
Right. Yeah, and then the whole brother of the Lord thing I've harped on a lot, and I know that you have too. But
and for people who are aware, like, we don't need to get into all the discussion and debate about that. Like, this has been covered multiple times. We know about these things. These are not surprises to us. There is peer-reviewed literature on these things, on the historicity of Jesus and Lataster's book for Brill. But on the historicity of Jesus, we'll give you the most direct examples of this. So if you want to see the peer-reviewed literature, what it says on these things, it's there. You can go do it. Ehrman, I wish he would do it. I wish he would do what he's morally and epistemically obligated to do as a scholar in this field, which is read the peer-reviewed literature that he's supposed to be discussing before discussing it. And then respond to it. Don't just ignore it and then make the same claims that it already rebutted as if there are no rebuttals. At least make a rebuttal, at least answer our arguments, right? So at least engage in an argument is my position on this. So yeah, for people at home, we won't belabor going into the whole spiel about these passages about how, for example, Paul never references disciples. The word disciple doesn't exist in Paul. So Ehrman is just assuming that when Paul references the first apostle, Kephas, Peter, that he's referring to disciples. When he refers to the 12, he's just assuming he's referring to disciples. But Paul never says they're disciples, never says they met Jesus before he died. These are really pertinent facts that are being omitted here that kind of change the complexion of what's going on. And the other thing, like you've mentioned, the brothers issue, Paul says all baptized Christians are brothers of the Lord. So when he refers to brothers of the Lord, what does he mean? At no point in the letters of Paul does he ever specify, oh, I mean biological brothers of Jesus. He might mean that, but he never says he means that. And we know he can mean cultic brothers, not biological. So it's all of this kind of stuff that we've mentioned that Ehrman is just glossing over as if it doesn't exist, and he's just laughing it off. It's argument by laughter. It's not scholarship.
Yeah, and
I've just gets my goat.
I've the reason why I brought up the brothers thing in the first place was just because I've been unsuccessful in getting anybody to explain to me why that particular verse strictly only ever means a blood relationship, and right. I have not been able to get anybody to do that.
Yeah, and I find a lot of people they'll make arguments up. So I've noticed they'll make assertions. They'll invent an argument from the armchair on the spot. One of them is, well, it has the definite article in front of it. Therefore, it means whatever. And I was like, so you just made that up. Yes, it does have the definite article, but you didn't check any other of the instances of fictive brother identification. They use the definite article. And if you had checked, you would know that. You would know that that's a non-starter, that argument. Oh, okay, I can't use that argument. No, they didn't check. They just made it up on the spot. And I've seen even professionals do this. This is shameful behavior. You should be ashamed if you're making an argument like that. You should know. If the question should be, oh, it's a definite article. Does that mean what I think it means? Let me check. On the other fictive references to brothers, does he use the definite article in those other cases? And then you would check, and you would find the answer is yes. And you go, oh, okay, the hypothesis refuted. I can't use that argument. And then you move on to your next argument, right? That's how a scholar behaves. This is not how Bart Ehrman is behaving. But anyway, that argument is not, let's be clear, it's not an argument Ehrman makes in this video. I don't want to attribute it to him. It is an argument other people have made.
Right. Yeah, definitely. But to move on from Paul's work, which there was some other things in there, he totally misrepresents what Docetists believe in the comments video, and he makes it out to be it's something.
Is that
totally
a separate
different.
video?
It
is that a different video? Okay, I didn't see that video, so yeah.
No, yeah. So I'm trying to limit any kind of springing of things on you that you haven't prepared for. But the main
you know what, you can, even if you do, and I don't it's something that I'm not familiar with. I'll just say I'm not familiar with that, and I can't answer that here. I'll go check because I'm a scholar. If I don't know something, I check.
Well, I mean, are you interested to hear how he describes Docetists?
I guess. Okay. My thoughts on Docetism are complex, but yeah, go for it.
Okay. Let me get to it real quick.
Now, this is unrelated to the Holy Koolaid article, right? Or Holy Koolaid video, right? This is a separate Q&A.
Well, it's a separate Q&A, but with Holy Koolaid.
Oh, I see. Okay. But it's different. It's a different video. Okay.
Right.
Is it one that was shot after the first one?
Yeah.
So these are comments on the first video? That's right. Relevant. Okay.
Yes.
Got it.
Yep. Okay, so here he is talking about Docetists. Just leading up to this, he's Thomas kind of says, well, the claim that there was nobody claiming myth prior to the 1800s is false because there were Docetists. And so this is how Bart describes what a Docetist is.
Sure.
Not to mention all of the Greco-Roman influences into Christianity. I think that that's pushback to the claim you said no one in ancient times claimed Jesus didn't exist. And
the Docetists thought Jesus existed.
But this is a claim that there was no fleshly Jesus, that it's this...
No. This is completely misunderstanding Docetism. Okay. And if you don't think I know about Docetism, I've written extensively about Docetism. So if they want to know something about Docetism, read my book on the Orthodox corruption of Scripture. Because I actually
learned about Docetism through misquoting Jesus, your book.
Yeah, but they're misunderstanding if they think that this indicates that Jesus was not a being on earth. What they think is what the Docet. So first of all, 2 John does not mention Docetists. So I'm not sure what they're. I guess there is a passage in 1 John, and there's a kind of a brief reference to it in 2 John.
Did they just confuse 2 John with 2 Peter?
Maybe. I'm not sure. I don't know what the
I feel
John
like that's
reference
what's
is.
happened here. I feel like that they've gotten confused. I don't know where the confusion occurred, whether it was in the comments or Holy Koolaid or Bart Ehrman. Anyway, I think if I get it correctly, I think the reference should be to 2 Peter, where there's a reference to other Christians who claim that all the historical accounts of Jesus are mythical. Now, one can argue whether that's what's being said there. I think it's pretty obvious that's what's being said there. But that is the most relevant. That is one of the most relevant passages to believing Christians who thought that it was all cleverly devised myths. That's an exact quote. The cleverly devised myths. And there were Christians who were saying this, not opponents of Christianity.
Right.
And so that would be relevant to this discussion. So for him to think 2 John, someone's made a mistake somewhere and has either Herman has gotten confused or someone has confused him inappropriately on this. And that's unfair to him, I think, if he's. Because he's right. There's nothing in 2 John that's relevant. But yeah, let's continue.
But they're not called Docetists, and we don't know about Docetists per se until the 2nd century. But these are kind of forerunners of Docetism. These people do not deny that there is a man Jesus. Docetists do not deny there's a man Jesus. What they think is that the person who was the man Jesus was in fact a divine being who did not have real flesh and blood, but he was still a person on earth who spoke, who did things, who did miracles, who was active with his disciples. They did not think he was a myth. Quite the opposite. They definitely did not think he was a myth. And so you can't use the Docetists. So why?
So that's pretty much the meat of the clip right there. And I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
So what he's saying is correct on its surface. So there's a complexity here. Is that Docetism is not a phrase that existed in antiquity. There's no ancient discussion of Docetists. That is a modern scholarly construction, and I think it's problematic in the same way that Gnosticism has turned out to be. The West Star Institute published a research report finding that Gnosticism didn't exist, and they're right. There are no references to Gnostics. The words are being mistranslated, and certain ideas are being implanted into the text that aren't there, and so on. The idea of Gnosticism was a modern construct. It's a scholarly construct meant to explain certain other phenomena. Now, all of the things that are a part of Gnosticism did exist in the ancient world, but there's no religion, no sect of Christianity had all of those components, and there's no sect of Christianity that lacked all of them. So the phrase is kind of meaningless, right? So like all sects had all different kinds of, an example is like gnosis as a mystery, like secret knowledge that is relevant to your salvation. All Christian sects believe that, right? So even Irenaeus, or Clement of Alexandria, who are arguing against the so-called Gnostics, they say people who claim to know things, they're ragging on them, but they're not ragging on them because they claim their secret knowledge. Everybody agrees their secret knowledge. What they're ragging on them for is that their secret knowledge is bogus, right? So it's just a sectarian debate over what the secret knowledge is. It's not a dispute over the role of gnosis in salvation. So Gnosticism in that sense was a modern construct. It didn't exist, but all the things did exist, right? This makes it complicated. And Docetism, I think, is the same way. What Ehrman just described is correct from the perspective of what I would say is the mainstream consensus in scholarship right now, in the same way that the same statement about Gnosticism would have been correct 10 years ago. But I think you could have a Westar report about Docetism that would find the same result, that the modern construct is false, that there's no such thing as what Ehrman is talking about in the ancient world as a full construct. Some of the ideas he mentioned did exist, but they were scattered amongst different sects from different perspectives. And there was a lot of different things. So when you look at the Docetist literature, they'll lump in a whole bunch of radically different things. Like, for example, there was a teaching that we hear reference to that Jesus wasn't crucified because Simon of Cyrene switched places. And so he was crucified in Jesus' place, and so Jesus got away, right? So, and this is called Docetism. So that is not what Ehrman just described, right? But that gets lumped in with Docetism, but that's obviously a completely different sectarian teaching. It's not the same thing. And what Ehrman described, we can find examples something like that going on. Like he says, it's in the 2nd century, particularly late 2nd century. But what he just described does not accurately describe all of the texts that we have that refer to what he means by Docetism. Now, those texts don't call it Docetism. This is the problem, right? But things that get lumped together as Docetism include a bunch of passages that do not fit what Ehrman just described. Now, it's completely understandable that he would not know this because it requires more work than what he's done on Docetism. Now, he says he tries to boast of how much he knows about Docetism, but really he hasn't written a book on Docetism. He has read what scholars are saying. He has not fact-checked whether what those scholars said is correct or accurate. So he is correctly representing the peer-reviewed scholarship, which is totally respectable. But I think there's a flaw here, and I don't want to overly criticize him for it, is that if you went to go and check the facts, the actual texts themselves, the claims of modern scholarship of Docetism do not hold up very well. They're a bit shaky. And a good example is what would be relevant to this conversation right here, which is Ignatius. Ignatius says a bunch of things about these competing Christians that he's telling his Christians to shun. Don't even talk to them. And he lists the things that you have to believe to not be one of them. And the list is way more specific and particular than what Ehrman is talking about, where Ignatius says, no, Jesus really was born. Jesus really was crucified by Pontius Pilate. Jesus really did eat meals with the disciples. He goes through this, really did. And these are things that what it's very clear, whoever Ignatius is arguing against is not the people Ehrman is talking about. Whoever Ignatius is arguing against is someone who's saying that Jesus did not eat food with the disciples. Jesus was not born. Jesus was not crucified by Pontius Pilate, right? These are Christians who are denying these propositions. So this is not people who say, oh, he only appeared to. These are people who are denying that it happened at all. And these are Christians. So these are not Docetists. Now, it is true that modern scholars assume that Ignatius is talking about Docetists, and they'll just argue from this assumption all the time. Yes, that is where the mainstream consensus is on this. I think they're wrong, and I think they're provably wrong. But that's at least an argument we can have. And so I can't bash Ehrman too much for making this response here, because he is at least accurately regurgitating the peer-reviewed scholarship back as a response to this. And so that is at least a legitimate starting point for an argument. And then, of course, the next response would be what I just said, and then he would have his argument back, and then we would go back and forth, and that's how scholars would argue. And that would be totally fair. But that's my thoughts. That's why I said my thoughts are very complicated about Docetism. So I don't think Ehrman is wrong to give this answer. I think he's wrong, but for complex reasons that you can't simply assume that he would know these things just off the top of his head.
Well, it struck me as weird, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but it struck me as weird because, for one thing, he totally neglects 2 Peter and what that says right there. And I don't know if at the time I didn't think that maybe he was mistaking 2 John for 2 Peter or whatnot.
I think that's what's happening, and I think that's what he thinks. He has the idea of the passage in his head. He thinks he's assuming that it's an anti-Docetist passage, which a lot of modern scholars do. So that's why he's picking up this assumption. It's an assumption that he and most other scholars are not fact-checking. It's just a dogma in the field. Someone made the assumption, and then ever since, people just keep repeating it. I don't think it holds up. I don't think it is a valid inference, but it is at least a respectable peer-reviewed inference. It is what's so I think what Ehrman is saying is like it is a sensible answer for him to give. It's not the end of the argument, is what I would say.
Right, exactly. Okay, so that was my issue with his little Docetus thing. But now to the meat of kind of what I wanted to get to here, and that's the bulk of the reason why it seems like Bart Ehrman, as well as other people, think that Jesus definitely existed, is this whole idea that the Gospels represent independent sources. And so I have about a minute clip here to play where he talks about how they're not independent or something, and then I can elaborate as to why he actually thinks that.
Then you got to figure out if they were accurate. Different things. So obviously for the historical Jesus, we have the main sources are the four Gospels of the New Testament. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are our four narratives that tell us about the life of Jesus. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are not independent of each other. Matthew and Luke both used Mark as one of their sources. They copied portions of Mark for the stories they all share. But Matthew and Luke had other sources as well, and Mark had sources, and John probably did not use Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So you have those four, and those four actually represent earlier sources that they were using. Mark is usually considered the earliest gospel, written around 70, John around the year 95. So these are about 40 to 65 years after Jesus' death. There are also references to Jesus in the writings of the Apostle Paul, and those can be helpful for a number of things as well.
Okay. So that's kind of him laying out there, and I'll backtrack a little bit to his the diagram. So basically, he goes off of the whole idea of Q, M, and L, and then John all being independent accounts. And I'm just wondering if you can give your thoughts.
Yeah,
on that.
That's totally made up. Like there's literally zero evidence for any of this. And he does, like I said, the argument I mentioned earlier that he gives is completely fallacious. It's not an argument that would be given in any other field of history. You don't just say that, well, we don't have a source for this, therefore they did. That's not necessarily how, you need to argue for that. You need evidence for that. And especially when we know these are authors who are making stuff up. We know they're very fond of making things up. All the Gospels. There are some 40 Gospels that we know about. Super fond of making things up. Look at the infancy Gospels, made up. Look at the Proto-Evangelion of James, made up. So they love making things up. So the question is maybe they have sources, but how do you know? You need evidence for this assertion. You can't just say, oh, whatever in Luke isn't in Mark or Matthew comes from L. It's a source. And not only does Luke have that source, Herman says we have that source.
Mm-hmm.
That's bullshit. No historian acts like this in any other field. No, we do not have that source. We don't even know if there is such a source. It is hypothesis. It is pure hypothesis. And it's a hypothesis for which there is no evidence. Like there's none. Like none at all. So this is not how we should be behaving as scholars when we deal with this material. But I think he does this because of that sort of false dichotomy, the black and white argument that he makes earlier, where it's either one or the other. It's like, no, most of the stuff we don't know. We don't know if Luke made stuff up. The stuff, let's call it the L material. We don't know if that's stuff all that Luke made up. We don't know if he got it from oral lore. We don't know if he got it from other documents. We don't know. Dr. Ehrman, we do not know. End of story, really. Unless you have evidence that shows that we do know, that actually produces knowledge, not assertion. And so he's just not doing that here. He just doesn't do it at all. And I'm flabbergasted by it. This doesn't happen in other fields of history. And I don't understand why he's so confident that this is an appropriate way to interact with sources.
Right.
He also says he claims we know there are tons of oral sources. This is another thing he claims. We know there are tons of oral sources. We don't know that either. We don't know there are any oral sources, right? Like we hypothesize that there might be oral sources for some of this material. Maybe. We don't know that. That's not knowledge. And so that completes that whole point. Is like this is not helpful. This whole diagram here is the way he's describing this diagram is useless to us as historians. It's not how history works.
Right. Do you think that it complicates his case when he says that like the L and M source are actually multiple different sources underneath it?
No, I think that's responsible of him. Okay. I think that's because it would be worse if he denied that, right? Like if he said, "Oh, M is a source," and we have it, that would be worse than admitting, "Oh, M material could come from a variety of sources." Yes, that is because it could. That is actually true. It could also be made up, is the part that he's leaving out, or that he has no valid reason to reject as an explanation. It could be any or all of those things, and without evidence that it is one of those things, we can't say that it is, whether in his favor or mine. And so yes, I think I think that's to his credit that he admits that the L and M material could come from multiple different. Not only different sources, but different kinds of sources. He admits some of it could be oral, some of it could be written materials of different kinds. That's all true. I mean, it could be.
Okay. No, good. Because I know that people might try to get to that position, so I'm glad you handled that. But now, one of the things is that he claims that John didn't use the other gospels, like he wasn't exposed to.
This is on my list. I have a long list of examples of his glaring ignorance in this. That was shocking to me. And I'm not looking at it now, but down at the bottom of my notes, item after item after item. This is one of them. It's another thing that I'm just flabbergasted that he would say this. And he literally asserts it like he's shocked that anyone would even suggest this, right? Like, oh, no one says that. I didn't even think I have a quote somewhere in there like, no one says this, or who knows that? And I'm like, dude, like the majority of Johannine experts say this. Mm-hmm. Right, this is the peer-reviewed literature on John studies. Most of the leading scholars too, like the big ones who've published heavily on John, they are all on board with this. That John definitely used the Synoptic Gospels. He used Luke more than the others, but he also uses Mark. He even quotes some of the phrases from Mark verbatim, and they even agree that like this, it looks like there's some evidence that uses Matthew, but much less. So John is heavily based on Luke and Mark, and there's so many things weird about Ehrman's treatment of this. First, that he wouldn't know this about his own peer-reviewed literature about Johannine studies. So how does he not know that this is a mainstream peer-reviewed position that John relies on the Synoptic Gospels? It would be different if he knew about it and had arguments against it, but he doesn't even know it. You see what I mean? Like, this is what shocks me the most. Like, how can you sit there and which means he hasn't read the literature, incidentally. So how can he sit there and pontificate and make these assertions and laugh it off if he knows he hasn't checked? He doesn't know what the peer-reviewed literature's position is on this. If he did, he would know that they actually agree with the fact that John is adapting material from the Synoptics. So that was one thing that shocked me, that the behavior is inappropriate, that kind of overconfidence when you know you haven't checked, and also not knowing. I don't know how Ehrman could not know this about his own peer-reviewed literature. But the other side of this is something even weirder, which is he goes on often about the Gospel of John not adapting material. And he gives this argument for both things we're talking about here. So also for his arguments for M and L, and for this weird position about John. The arguments one of the arguments that he makes is flabbergastingly wrong, and again betrays total ignorance of the field, which he says like the material in L and M, and you could say the same about John. I'm sure he would say the same about John. Has what he calls literary characteristics. That's a direct quote from the thing. He doesn't go into what characteristics he means, but it's true. M and L and John possess literary characteristics. There is a particular reason why this is. The Gospels are literary documents.
Yeah.
Okay, so it sounds silly, but no, it's true. And let me explain, because this shows that he doesn't know. Again, I mentioned this before. He doesn't know anything about on the scholarship on ancient education, on ancient literary composition theory. He doesn't know anything about this stuff. Because if he did, he wouldn't say this. He would never say this. Because if you knew how schools taught composition in Greek, which means all the authors of the Gospels took this training. There were no other schools they could go to. So these are the schools. This is what they were taught. how to compose stories. It is exactly how the stories are composed in the Gospels. All the things that he's calling literary characteristics are exactly the techniques taught in schools for composition. And in particular, the schools specifically, most particularly, taught the technique that John uses. Because this is the thing, if you knew how literature was produced, you would never make this ignorant statement that Ehrman did. He talks about how John doesn't quote verbatim from any of the other Gospels. Yeah, because that's what schools actually taught you to do. They taught you to use sources by rewriting it in your own words. So John is actually more in alignment with Greek educational compositional practice. He's taking his sources and rewriting it in his own words. And because we know that's how they were taught, and that we know that's how literature is produced, we know that's how every other author used sources, nearly every other author used sources, you cannot argue that therefore this stuff must come from a source other than Luke or Mark or Matthew, because they were specifically taught to compose these stories in this way. We know that. And we know they were taught to emulate other authors. So we know they're emulating Mark. They were taught specifically to do that, right? So it's not just copying Mark, but when they're doing the same thing that Mark is doing, but telling their own stories, but using the same techniques and the same ideas and concepts that Mark does. That is how they were taught to write. And anyone who'd studied compositional theory in antiquity would know this, which tells me that Bart Ehrman has not studied any of this stuff. He doesn't know any of this, which means he's not qualified to be discussing these things. He needs to go catch up, read up on the literature so that he knows all of this stuff, so that he can comment competently on these points. And so when you look at like the way Matthew and Luke use Mark, which is almost verbatim with some changes, we call that redaction rather than the use of sources normally. The use of sources, when you look at like Josephus using a source, or Pliny using a source, or Plutarch using a source, what they do is they rewrite the source in their own words. And they may be fairly close too, but they'll still be their own words. That's what they normally do. When you take a text and just copy it and make a few changes and maybe some additions, that's called redaction. And we have examples. The Ignatian letters exist in multiple redactions. It's not like the second or third redactions of the Ignatian letters are using the first letters as sources. No, they're rewriting the letters, changing some things and adding stuff. That's redaction, not source, not the use of sources. Same with the Lives of Aesop. The Lives of Aesop exist in multiple recensions. And so they're just, you take one version, you copy it, make some changes, update some things, and add some stuff. And that's the Lives of Aesop. No one says that like the life D, it goes A, B, C, D, that's how they're labeled in the Lives of Aesop. No one says, the Life of Aesop D is using a Life of Aesop A as a source. No, they're saying that D is rewriting C, which rewrote B, which rewrote A. So this is how it actually works. This is how, like, if Herman knew what he was talking about, this is what he would have explained. So you cannot argue that John didn't use the synoptics because he's not quoting them verbatim, even though, again, he uses exact phrases from Mark on occasion. But you could explain that. One could explain that with oral lore or whatever. But you can't make the argument positively that he didn't use the synoptics because he changed it, because we know that's how authors normally use sources. How Matthew and Luke, what they did to Mark is actually unusual and a very particularly different thing than John is doing. It actually looks like they're trying to pretend that their gospel is the actual gospel. They're rewriting the gospel rather than writing their own gospel. And that is a very particular kind of literary activity that has its own genre and its own analysis and its own literature. If you want to understand what they're doing, you got to go look at those other examples. You got to look at the recensions of Ignatius. You got to look at the recensions of the Lives of Aesop and so on. That is a different thing than what John is doing. But what John is doing is totally well attested as standard stuff. So his argument is false because it's ignorant. He doesn't understand. He doesn't know how composition worked in antiquity. So the argument is fallacious. Now, it doesn't work the other way around. You can't say just because, well, therefore John must have used the synoptics. You do have to have evidence that he did. And there's tons of it. And there's tons of peer-reviewed literature documenting the parallels, the way John redacted his material, the way he reused it and rewrote it, how he changed it, how he's arguing with the Gospel of Luke. Like he actually does things that are in argument with the content of Luke. There's literature on this. There's tons. And I cite a lot of it in chapter 10 of On the Historicity of Jesus. So his argumentation here is just completely ignorant. And it's not because he's an amateur. It's just because he's lazy, I think. Like, he just doesn't check these things. And it's laziness combined with arrogance, right? So it's not like he's lazy and says, well, I haven't looked into that. I'm too lazy. I'm not gonna. No, he pretends to know as if he's done it. And it's the combination of those two vices that it kind of make Bart Ehrman what he is in this debate. And it's shameful. And I wish he wouldn't act like this. There's no reason for him to do that.
I agree. And just to point out, one of those examples that you were just talking about is actually John's Lazarus is actually a rebuttal against Luke's Lazarus, because they're two totally different versions. And the messages of both, the message of John's Lazarus actually is arguing against
directly against the message of Luke. Yes.
Right.
Luke's use of Lazarus. And for people who want to know this, I have that on the historicity of Jesus. And I found this myself, but as a scholar, when I was doing the work on the historicity of Jesus, was doing the postdoc research project on that, I checked. I went to the literature to see, did anybody else discover this? And yes, I noticed multiple other authors and scholars have noticed the same thing. I'm not the only one. And we all independently of each other discovered the same thing, which is actually good corroboratory evidence that we're seeing a thing that's actually there. And so I wish Ehrman would do things like that, like actually check the literature and before pontificating on stuff. But
now, a little bit later on in this particular portion, he talks about how there's good arguments against, or at least that we know Luke definitely didn't use Matthew. Maybe he didn't use that strong of language, but I don't know if you know why he says this.
No, I still to this day do not know. I didn't catch him like being too adamant about that in this video, but he has said that. So he said that in, I think it was, I can't remember now. There's one of his books, he does say this, and he has a footnote where he mentions Goodacre, and he just dismisses Goodacre. He does not cite any refutation of Goodacre. He does not give any arguments. Ehrman always says there are good arguments for X, but he never gives those arguments. He never explains what they are or refers to them. So I don't know what to do with that. Well, but there aren't, by the way. There are no good arguments for Q. There are bad arguments for Q. There are a lot of bad arguments for Q. There are no good ones, which is why I've abandoned Q. Like Q would have been a super helpful theory for me in my research, but I just couldn't buy it. Like I felt lied to. When I actually did the fact checking of the Q arguments, I found that almost everything I was told about Q by Q advocates in the peer-reviewed literature was false, like literally false. And that kind of pisses me off, right? I was like, well, fuck you and your damn fake theory. Don't lie to me about what the evidence says. And so when you go check what the actual evidence says, it doesn't back them up. It doesn't hold up. And the only way they can defend themselves is they have to invent these convoluted epicycle theories to explain away all the evidence against them and to maintain their position, even though Occam's razor would leave them with the obvious solution, which is that Luke is just redacting Matthew. That's what Luke is doing. There's no need for another document to explain the content.
Well, so he actually gives at least one argument in support of Luke not using Matthew in the comments video, and it's about 2 minutes long. What it basically comes down to is it's this argument from sequences. I don't know if you've heard that. Basically, what it is he says that the material that's like specific, like the material that could have been used from Matthew and Luke, apparently they're out of sequence from how Matthew wrote about it. And because of that, that means that Luke didn't use Matthew.
Yeah, this is false twice. It's false both methodologically because they do the same thing with Mark, and you wouldn't say then that therefore they didn't use Mark as a source, right? Mm-hmm. So just because they take Mark and put him out of order doesn't mean that they didn't do it, right? So you can't say Luke didn't use Matthew because he moved everything out of order. Well, that's what they both did with Mark. So that's how they use sources, right? So that's a dead argument. It's a fallacy right off the top. It's also false. There are counter examples to that. There are actually sequences that Luke and Matthew actually follow, where Luke is clearly following Matthew's sequence. So yes, they move things around all the time, but there are telltale signs of them occasionally just getting lazy and copying the same sequence from each other. So that's what I mean. It's false, right? The premise is false. But the logic is not there either. Even if the premise was true, the conclusion would not follow.
Right. It seemed really weird to me because it's like you're trying to tell me that they're creating this literary thing about Jesus and they can't move stuff around. Like,
yeah, right.
I don't understand how that makes
which gets
sense.
to like not knowing how compositional theory works. Like ancient compositional theory, moving things around is typical, right? Like that's not unusual. But this tells me another thing about Ehrman is he simply just regurgitated this from the literature. This argument that you're repeating, because it's very familiar to me. So he's read the Q literature, the scholarship that are pro Q. This is an argument they make, and it is an argument that I found that was false and fallacious, and that's why I abandoned it. But instead of doing what I did and actually checking if it's true and checking if the logic holds up, Ehrman just believes it, and well, that's what the scholarship says, and then just regurgitates it. And so that's what he has done here. So at least to his credit, he's regurgitating actual peer-reviewed scholarship, which means he actually at least read it. So bully for that. But what he didn't go that extra step of actually checking is, are they right, or are they even telling me the truth about this? Like, are these scholars even correct? And are they correct in either premise, right? So the premise is, are there examples of Luke following the sequence of Matthew? You should check first, right? And then the other premise is moving things around a common redactional activity. Did Matthew and Luke do it to Mark? Like, that should be your first question. And once you find out the answer is yes, you go, oh, well, okay, so that argument's dead. I can't use it. Like, that's how a scholar would normally act, right? It's like that's an interesting hypothesis. I'm going to check that. Does that hold up? And you would check both premises, right? That's what you should be doing in this kind of stuff. And it's so frustrating to see scholars who literally are trained to know better just don't do this. These simple fact checks like this. Simple logic checks.
Yeah. Now, one thing that Holy Koolaid does ask Bart is, basically that, some mythicists out there will say that the Gospels are really just one source, and that's Mark, as the quote unquote independent source.
Yeah.
So what do you think about that?
I think there was a confusion there. The way Koolaid asked the question might have put a certain idea in Ehrman's mind, and Ehrman was correctly rebutting that idea. Because if you listen to his rebuttal, it is a correct rebuttal to a particular statement. It's just not the statement that mythicists make. And in this case, I don't think Holy Koolaid was misrepresenting mythicists. I just think he had a badly worded question.
Okay.
And so the argument is not that all the Gospels just copy from Mark. That kind of, it's sort of a hyperbolic, vague statement that doesn't get to the nitty gritty of what's actually being said. And so they're not saying that the nativity in Matthew is a copy from Mark. Obviously not. No one says that. No mythicist says that Matthew copied the nativity from Mark. No, what they mean is that they copied Mark and they added stuff. So like if you start from the premise that Mark made everything up, right? So it's really hard for people to do counterfactual reasoning, and it's one of the biggest problems for historians generally, but especially in biblical studies. But if you start from the premise that Mark did make everything up, like if you just grant for a moment that the mythicists are right. Now, if mythicism is true, then it is true that Mark made everything up, right? Or at least someone made everything up, and then Mark is using that made up stuff. But let's simplify it and say Mark made everything up. If that's the case, and then you get to the subsequent Gospels, you should expect them to add stuff, to make more stuff up, right? So it's not. So it's the point is that the mythicist view is that they all copied Mark and just added to it. Same way that recensions of Ignatius happened, the same way the recensions of the lives of Aesop happened. All of this stuff. The same way that many lives of the saints do the same thing, where you have different versions and they add more stuff, they copy stuff from the original and they add stuff. Like that's what happens, right? So when people say, well, all the Gospels are just based on Mark, they're not saying that all the Gospels, all their content is an exact copy from Mark. It's not what they're saying. What they're saying is that they got Mark, and then they're adding stuff and making stuff up and adding to it, just like Mark did, right? They're doing the same thing Mark did, and so that there aren't any sources. And so what the mythicists are saying is like, we have no evidence that is not what happened. And Ehrman is saying, well, you need evidence that it is what happened. Is it? No, we don't. We do not. You need evidence that it's not what happened, because we already have evidence that it's the kind of thing that was going on. So what we need is evidence that it is not what's going on. You need evidence that they have sources, that they're not just doing what the lives of Aesop did and just expanding on earlier redactions of the story. Like the person who's making the assertion has to declare that. We don't have to declare it was the other way around. All we have to declare is that we don't know. and therefore you can't use sources. The Gospels had sources as a premise. So we're just saying that the premise is gone. You can't say that they didn't, or you can't say that they did. We just can't do anything with it. So it just disappears as evidence. We can't use it as evidence because we can't establish that the Gospels had sources for any of this material. That's the argument. And I think Holy Koolaid misstated the argument. And I think he just did it by accident. And Ehrman was responding to the question that was asked, and his response was correct. But it isn't the argument that we're making. So he just wasn't responding to us. And in that case, that wasn't Ehrman's fault.
No, true. I didn't think that it was. I think that I feel like it highlights just how people misunderstand what mythicists are even claiming. Like whenever we say, items like that, because they have this misconception of how the Gospels were written. And it just, they seem to just make assumptions after that point, and we get to,
it's like the conversational theory. There's a science of conversation where, when you're speaking, people aren't really listening to you. They're just waiting for their turn to speak. Mm-hmm. And so they'll hear some keywords from you, and then they'll immediately assume that you said something that you didn't, because they have this idea in their head of what the argument is. You said a few things, and then they assume that's your argument. They didn't really listen to what you said. And then they butt in with their rebuttal. But the rebuttal is to the presumption of what you said, isn't to what you actually said. And this is a good example of that, where it's the assumption that when you say something like, well, it's all just based on Mark, they're just redactions of Mark. What they hear, it's not what you're saying, but what they hear is like, that's impossible. There's material in them that's not in Mark. It had to come from somewhere. And it's like, no, you don't understand what I'm saying. If you grant already that Mark is making stuff up, then they're making stuff up, etc. So it's like people just make they start with these assumptions. They don't really listen to you. They don't really hear what you say. They have this list of things that they just assume you're going to say. This is how you get the whole, I don't know if you have the clip where Ehrman does the weird thing about the sun gods and stuff, where he just goes off about this. It's like, okay, Ehrman it wasn't even a question that Holy Koolaid asked. So Koolaid was himself puts a disclaimer almost in there, like, I don't know what the hell is going on about right now. He doesn't say that, but he just says, what? Like there's a what in there. It is strange, but Ehrman was just assuming that Holy Koolaid meant a certain thing, even though it wasn't even in the question. And then he went off responding to a question that wasn't even asked in that case. But in that case, he just had a question, he just had an assumption about what mythicists argue in his brain, and he just implanted that assumption, just overlaid it over the question actually asked. And so I think people need to listen better. Don't assume that I'm making the same argument that you've heard from someone else. I might be, but you've got to listen and actually hear what I say, and then you'll know. So that's why even when I do that, I'll make the caveat, if I didn't hear exactly what they said, it sounded like this, and so I'll make the point, I'm not assuming that I know what they said because I wasn't there. But I'll say that I'll respond to what was presented to me here, as if that's what they said. But it doesn't matter, if that's, I'm not declaring that's what they said. They might have said something else. But I think people need better listening skills. Is what I think, and to have less preconceptions. Less preconceptions, not just about how to defend historicity, but less preconceptions about what mythicism is even arguing.
I totally agree. Now we do have to get to super chats. So anybody,
cool.
If you got any questions, please throw that in there. There were a couple of other things I really wanted to get to, but maybe I can get you on again sometime, maybe in January, to kind of handle it.
We hit all the major points I wanted to hit. Okay. I'm looking through my list. There's a few things I could go on about, but it's not as important as the things we've talked about. So let's do the super chats. And if you want me on again, anytime. So even right now, if you want to do another hour, I just need to run to the restroom. So if I did that, we can hang out here for another hour. Does that sound, or do you want to close it half an hour from now?
Oh yeah. Well, I was going to close it out because I got to call my son. But...
We've already done about 2 hours, haven't we? Okay. Yeah. Let's do super chats. Yeah. And then if you want me on another time, yes, 2 hours is plenty.
Yeah. I mean, trust me, but me and you, we could go over this for, 3 or 4 hours, I'm sure. But so the first super chat that we got is Hellbound Hillbilly, who just says, woo, quote unquote, Dr. GE. And then we got Reality Revolutions. I don't know if you remember them, but
of course.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, Haley. They sent in just a blank super chat, so thank you so much there,
Awesome.
Lee, for that. Alex Baranowski says that they just got their COVID booster and flu vaccines yesterday. Aside from the slight injection site and soreness, I feel fine. Well, I'm glad they haven't gotten 5G access yet.
Huzzah!
And then we got Reality Revolutions again, who says Mark allegorically copied Paul, then the other Gospels copied Mark. That is it.
I mean, see, that oversimplifies everything, right? So obviously it can't be that is it. Because we like the nativity. Obviously, Matthew added the nativity to Mark, so he's not just copying from Mark. He's making stuff up as well as adding to Mark, or as copying Mark. And also, Mark doesn't just allegorize Paul. Like a lot of Mark is doing that, and I know I didn't hear Ehrman disagreeing with that in this video, but I've heard that he does dismiss it in other places. Once again, like there's a lot of good peer-reviewed scholarship that shows that very clearly Mark is taking material from Paul and turning it into stories, and using the actual compositional styles that we know that they were taught at the time. So we know that's a thing, but there's a lot of content in Mark that is not that. It's other things that Mark is doing. Mark's doing a lot of things. Like he's an author who has a lot of goals. He uses a lot of techniques and tools to build. He's, like you said earlier, he's not just copying one document. Right. So authors were not like that back then. That's not how people acted.
And then we got X Zorro, who says it's 1,000 Indian rupees, equivalent to 13 or 14 US dollars. If you people are wondering, that's it. No message, just here for Richard Carrier.
Awesome. Yeah.
Let's see. And then we've got Kristen Hood, who's pretty active in the mythicist groups that I'm in. Just showing her support. Thank you so much. Then we got Jason Kolasik, who says know too little about the subject, so just busy, but he says bus girl, but I think that was buying. Oh, bot, the app you're both associated with. Okay, so thank you so much there, Jason. I've got updates coming. I'm working on them. It's just I've been pretty busy this year, despite the pandemic. Oh, yeah, here it is. Bought the Crestus app. Sorry for my covfefe. And then we got NPC Porky, who says, does Pliny's ignorance of Christians mean that Nero's persecution story is bogus and Tacitus was interpolated, or could his ignorance be justified?
Yeah, how would Pliny not know about that? It's a good question. Mm-hmm. I can come up with scenarios. Like I can come up with a hypothesis as to how that is. The question is not, is there a plausible explanation? The question is, what's probable? And I think the probability, there's other evidence in Tacitus and outside Tacitus that suggests that Tacitus did not write the crucial line about Pontius Pilate. That in fact, that whole material is about a different messianic sect that had nothing to do with Christianity. I've written a journal article under peer review on this. So that's debatable. But if we assume that Tacitus did write that, and you look at all the other possibilities, the only thing that could have been, like the only sequence of events that I can think that would fit would be Pliny heard some stories from some Christians. Tacitus asked Pliny for some information about his histories, which we know Tacitus did. A lot of Tacitus used Pliny as a source often for things. And then Pliny told him that, and then Tacitus, when he was doing the research for Nero, ran into a story about it being about the Christians, and then Tacitus incorporating it. But the thing is that Christians seem not to have known about this. One of the arguments I point out, and not about the only one, there are multiple peer-reviewed articles by multiple scholars before me have pointed this out, that Tacitus is unlikely to have written this because no other Christian authors ever heard of this. The Neronian persecution in relation to the fire is unknown, even in books that specifically talk about the Neronian persecution. They've never heard of this. So how is it possible that Tacitus knows more about Christian history than Christians themselves? and that's a problem. Another problem is his most likely source would have been Pliny the Elder, who wrote a detailed history of Nero's reign. And Pliny the Younger was his nephew and adopted son, and admired the hell out of him and read all his stuff. Huge admirer. Pliny the Younger was a huge admirer of Pliny the Elder and his works. So that kind of tells us, when Pliny says, I don't know anything about these Christians or what they've been tried for or whatever, that tells us that that passage was not in Pliny the Elder's history. Pliny the Elder's account of Nero's persecution clearly cannot have mentioned Christians, because if it did, Pliny would have known that. And so the fact that Pliny doesn't know that means that Pliny the Elder didn't say that, which means that can't have been in Tacitus' source. So that narrows the options as to where Tacitus could have gotten a thing. I think the balance of arguments, when you put it all together, and there are many more that I've mentioned just now, means that Tacitus didn't write that. That wasn't in Tacitus. It was unknown until the 4th century. Someone inserted it in the 4th century. Even the letters, Christians forged a whole correspondence between Seneca and Paul called the Letters between Seneca and Paul. And there's a letter about the persecution. Even it has no knowledge of the Tacitan account of the persecution of Christians, because it talks about how Jews were persecuted, Jews were burned for it, and some Christians were rounded up along with the Jews by accident. It doesn't say that exactly. I'm paraphrasing, but so whoever wrote that, I think, read the original Tacitan passage, which said it was the Jews, and then decided to throw some Christians in, because Christians love to do that. There's multiple examples where Christians like to insert themselves into history where they didn't exist. The rain miracle of Marcus Aurelius, for example, the Domitilla connection with Domitilla and Clemens, and there's this whole group of so-called Christian saints that were actually just Jewish converts, no relation to Christianity, but Christians love to insert their history insert themselves into history. So I suspect whoever forged the letters of Seneca and Paul was using the original passage of Tacitus, and then someone got inspired by that to make a note in the margins of Tacitus that, oh, this is this particular thing, even though it's not. And then a later scribe added it in, or did it deliberately, put it in deliberately, to make Tacitus say what the letters of Seneca and Paul implied. So that's my theory, and there is evidence for it. It's not a theory off the seat of my pants. But if you want to see that, it's in Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ. All my peer-reviewed articles in journals on history are in Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ. So if you want to get access to those cheaply, that's the most affordable way.
Yeah, definitely. I have that book as well as, of course, all of your other books. But it's really great because you got that one paper or thing you did on the table talks. Hitler's Table Talk. Yeah, and that led to a whole book. Professor Mikael Nielsen of Sweden was inspired by my article to do a full deep dive, total Dan Brown on the thing, where he's talking to relatives, he's digging up archives, lost contracts, hunting people down all over Europe. And he did a full research project on that. And so he wrote a whole book that went way beyond what I did on Hitler's Table Talk, but it starts from the kernel of what I did. And there's a whole chapter in there on my article about how Enigma, the publishers, lied to him about their interaction with me about it. So there's a lot of interesting backstory, like hidden behind the scenes backstory that you might be fascinated to check out. It's an excellent book in a lot of ways. I highly recommend it. It's called Hitler Redux by Mikael Nielsen. Oh yeah, I'll have to check that out because I love some Hitler stuff.
Well, there's two fascinating takeaways from that book that, as a historian, I love. One is it shows how historians work, because his task is so hard. He has to actually explain what he did to get the information that he got and how he used the information to get the conclusions he did. So it's a really good example. It's modern history. We can't do the things for ancient history that he does because we don't have personal archives or contracts of the major players. Like we don't have Paul's entire household documentary archive. We don't have things like that, but we do for modern history. So he's able to do all kinds of interesting things. So you get to see the nuts and bolts of how history is done. So it's a great example of how to do history. The other side of it is, the other takeaway is that by the end of the book, you will shout out loud, Nazis are liars. Because I swear, there are so many sources for this that relate to this that are Nazis. Like they're the only people who know certain things, so you have to use them as sources. But every single one, Nilsson meticulously shows they just lied about something. Like all of them, every single character in his book who happens to be a Nazi is a liar, a demonstrative liar. Like he actually demonstrates it. Nilsson does, and I was like, oh my god! And you get to like by the 5th or 8th or 10th one of these, I'm like, oh my god, another Nazi who lied, really? So Nazis are liars is apparently a law of the universe.
Sounds about right. And the lawyers will want me to say that I like World War II history, not Hitler stuff.
Right.
So next comment we've got is Jane Pusecker, who says, "Hello, Richard. When you decided the journey of Jesus history, did you approach this with love and care to find the real Jesus, or was it mostly about proving people wrong? Sorry for the odd question."
Oh, it's actually a good question. Neither, interestingly enough. My objective was not to prove any particular kind of historical Jesus, but to test whether there was enough evidence to at least say that there was one. And to give you an example, I write in Jesus from Outer Space, which is my latest book on this. I have a chapter on other historical figures and like, why don't we think they not existed? They didn't exist. Why don't we think the same thing about them that we do about Jesus? Hannibal, Spartacus, Pilate, and so on. And I go through them like item by item, showing all the evidence we have that they existed. It's way more evidence, way better evidence too, than we have for Jesus. But the takeaway there is like, at no point do I argue that any particular historical story about Hannibal is true, or any particular version of Hannibal is true. All I need to do is document that there's enough evidence that he at least did exist. And that's a much lower bar to meet. It's easier to do that, right? So when I tested minimal mythicism against minimal historicity, I'm just testing like the minimum, like the most smallest, fewest claims you can make about Jesus. Was there at least just a dude? Like no matter what else is true about him, can we at least show that there was a guy? And when I approached it, I did not approach it from the assumption of debunking. I just said my goal was I'm going to research the hell out of this. I'm going to find all the evidence that there is for a historical Jesus and see if it holds up. And that was my goal. And so and the backstory, of course, is I was first wrote about this with Earl Doherty's book. People insisted I was a hardcore historicist, anti-mythicist all the way, and would talk about basically be like just Bart Ehrman's behavior the same way. But that's because at that time it was all amateurs and cranks, and I was sick and tired of their bullshit. But someone eventually said, a bunch of people actually, different people independently whose opinions I respect, said, no, you're right about all that other stuff, but you need to read Earl Doherty, which is I hadn't. And I didn't know anything about his work. And so you need to, Doherty, he seems to have the real deal. He seems to be doing competent, careful research. He's not doing all this crazy crank stuff. And so I did. I read that book. I wrote a review that was positive and negative. But the one thing, and I had criticisms, but the overall takeaway was like, well, he's got an interesting argument. I've never heard a rebuttal. So actually, I'm kind of agnostic now. I need to like find out more. And so when I actually got funded, I got a grant funding me to do the research. I was coming at it from the perspective of I'm not making an assumption either way. I just want to see whose theory holds up. And so I tested them both, and it came out a certain way. I would have been glad if it came out pro-historicity. I would have written my book all about how mythicism just doesn't hold up. I would have loved to have written that book. It just is not where the evidence goes.
Yeah, and I know one thing that you make plainly clear in anytime you talk about this, which apparently my camera has frozen for the second.
I saw that. Yeah.
One of the things you say is that you should not use mythicism as an argument against Christianity.
Right.
That this is an extremely niche sort of topic to talk about, and using it as an argument against Christianity is not that great.
Yeah, it's just bad rhetoric, because the case against the historicity of Jesus is thousands of times weaker than the case against the resurrection of Jesus. So why would you use an argument that's thousands of times weaker? Use this one that's thousands of times stronger, right? If you're going to argue against Christianity, just argue against the resurrection. You can grant historicity. I grant it. I can still prove that your resurrection theory is bullshit. And I can prove it to millions to one, billions to one probability. Like that's how strong we can be, how certain we can be of that. That is a far, far stronger argument than something that is only a 2 in 3 chance of being true. I mean, if you've got an argument whose premise is 2 in 3, and you've got a premise that's 1 billion to 1, dude, Take the billion to one. That's the argument you should be using. So you shouldn't be using mythicism as an argument against Christianity. Also because I think that I don't think Christians can ever accept it, right? So I don't think the only way that you can ever persuade someone that it's plausible that Jesus didn't exist is you've got to get them out of the delusion of the religion first. Like once they're out of the religion, they at least have a chance to look at the evidence anew in an unbiased way. But if you're a believer, you can't possibly even allow that Jesus didn't exist. That just the cognitive dissonance is just too overwhelming. So I don't think this is a debate that can even be had between Christians and atheists. It's only a debate that can be had between atheists about whether Jesus existed or not, because they're the only ones that have any chance of having a rational argument about this. I don't think Christians do.
Yeah, I agree, because most Christians are going to argue for the more magical version, like the gospel version.
Yeah, so just rebut that. It's easier. Right, yeah.
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 So next super chat we've got is from Daniel M., who says, for Dr. Carrier, is there something to be said for the church trying to rewrite history to make it fit their narrative? I got in late, so you may have already covered that.
Not sure what the question is. I mean, yes, they did that. I mean, all the sects have done that, right? Like even evangelical American Christianity is rewriting American history right now to support their bizarre white supremacist form of Christianity. So Christians always been doing that, and I think that's a reification, a sort of realization of Plato's Republic, because Plato said this is what you should do. You should make shit up and then punish anyone who tries to change it. And then just you have the guardians who know it's bogus, but who insist to everybody that it's true, and make sure the same story is taught to everybody, so as to control the populace, make them moral. It's the idea of moral control, which is actually a fundamental dogma of neocon philosophy today. So neoconservatives have the Plato's idea about religion, that you should pretend to be religious in order to make the public controllable and moral, because their view is that people will only be moral if they're either enlightened, and only the rare few are, or if you have the opium of the masses, you have a religion. And so I think that's the Catholic Church has started this idea of like, let's realize Plato's Republic for real, burn at the stake anybody who tries to rewrite our stories. We'll rewrite the stories the way we want them in order to control and influence the public. And I think that's kind of what Christianity has been as a vehicle for ever since, well, at least the Council of Nicaea. I don't think it's ever served any good other than that, and that's not even a good.
Yeah. I agree. Sorry, my camera has apparently decided that it is done for the night.
Is it doing the same thing mine did, where it won't
let
you turn it back on?
This is a separate thing. It's just how I've got it set up. I should have used my other like capture card, but for some reason I'm like, I'm going to use the expensive one, and I shouldn't have. But anyways, our last super chat comes from GCM, who says, what about the proposition and arguments that some or all of the canonical gospels post-date Marcion?
Oh, not tenable. I did look into this, not that specifically, but I looked into the dating of the gospels. We don't have really the ability to reliably date them very well. So I could say like it's logically possible to make the evidence fit a post-Marcionite contrivance of all the Gospels, but it is not by any stretch of the imagination a probable explanation of the evidence. Marcion seems more clearly a post-Gospel development. The Gospels seem to have already existed for quite some time before Marcion even came along to come up with his own doctrine.
Yeah. Well, I don't know that particular topic all that well, so I'll leave you with the final word on that. But Dr. Carrier, I'm so glad that you were able to join me tonight. This has been great. And
it's been good. Yeah.
Yeah. Like I said, I've got more things that we can go over, so I'll definitely hit you up and see what your schedule is like, maybe in January or something, because Bart has been all over the place here recently. Because
I've noticed. It's interesting. He must have lowered his rates.
Well, no. So he did one like lecture type thing that he was selling, and then this time, this time he's doing like a full day event on the Christmas story. Like, what's
that's cool.
I
support that. I think that's cool. I think he might actually have like cool things to say about that. I'll bet.
Huh. Yeah. So, I mean, it's all over the place. If anybody's interested in it, definitely go and check various people out that are pushing that. So it could be a good thing. It is an all day event though. So he's talking like the entire day.
That's far out.
Yeah. But in any case, Rick, I'm so glad that you were able to join me. Everybody, if you want to get more of this kind of information, you can get Rick's books or you can download the Crestus app. Both of those things are going to give you great information. Rick's books are going to go a lot more in depth about these topics. And so I'll have a link to his page. He's got a website, richardcarrier.info, where he posts his blogs and stuff like that. And he's got a whole list of all of his books. I definitely suggest getting any one of them. We have them all signed.
And you can find everything through richardcarrier.info. You can find a link to my Facebook, my Twitter, if you want to take classes from me, that's available there. Down the right margin, you'll find a link for Crestus if you want to go visit the Crestus website and check that out. And my blog and all my books and recommendations in various subjects of books to buy and so on. So everything's there, and my Patreon as well for people who want to support my blogging.
I definitely suggest that too, because you do really good blogs over there. I find myself.
Yeah, I do a thing that's only exists because I have patrons funding it, supporting it, which is long form scholarly blogs. Like that. Yeah. That's kind of an antiquated. You're talking about being bougie. Like this is an antiquated thing. Everybody's doing short TikTok videos now. Like, no. My thing is long form, very information rich, well researched blogs or well thought blogs. And so if you want that to exist, and you want more of it on a wide range of subjects, then become a patron on Patreon of my work, and that'll keep me in biscuits and keep me doing that.
Definitely. I suggest anybody that wants to definitely should do it. And before we go to the end cards here tonight, I just want to say good night, David. And I guess we will see you heathens on Monday. Bye, everybody.